The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
All right, totally different format for the show today. Things are a little mixed up, backwards, upside down because of the Columbus Day weekend and holiday. So we're actually going to go right to the phones today at 617-830-4750. Let's jump right into calls with our first caller from the 269 area code. Let's see what's on people's minds. A lot of news this week. Caller from 269, what's your name and what's on your mind today?
My name is Braden Kibbe from Kalamazoo.
Great. What can we do for you today?
Hey, I was just wondering, I wanted your opinion on the federal prohibition of marijuana and maybe what you think the timeline on that changing is.
Timeline is tough. I mean, if I'm against it. I'm against it. I think that at the top of the list in terms of really making progress on marijuana legalization and decriminalization, we've got to get cannabis rescheduled out of being Schedule 1 at the federal level. How it's going to happen, I don't know. I mean, I've done quite a bit of reading about this. There's one perspective, which is when we see some critical mass of states decriminalize and or legalize, then the federal government will take it more seriously. But there are people who don't agree with that, who say this is not like gay marriage in any way, and that's not going to happen. So I couldn't tell you. I mean, I would love to say within 5 years something would happen federally on marijuana, but I don't know, Braden. I'm not super optimistic.
Yeah, it's a rough life with the current attorney general, I guess.
Oh, yeah, big anti-pot guy. KKK wasn't bad until he found out that they were smoking pot, and then all of a sudden, I guess now, then it was a bad organization in his mind, you know?
Oh, yeah.
Yep. All right, Braden,
well, cool.
Thanks very much. Appreciate the call. That was a very specific question. I like that one. Right to the point. Okay.
Cool.
Taking your calls. Thanks, Braden. Appreciate it. Let's try our next caller from the 484. Caller from 484. What's your name? Where are you calling from?
Yes. Hello, David.
Yes.
Jared from Downingtown, PA. I haven't called in a while.
What's on your mind? And let's turn him up. I can barely hear Jared here.
Well, that's strange. Got speakerphones. But I'm just curious about the whole gun issue. Would you? Why exactly is it that America is so unique among its gun culture? And like, do you think we've gone past the point of no returns when it comes to guns? Like, have we just like gone, like we just have too many that it would be almost impossible to take all the guns away, at least democratically wise? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I don't know of anyone trying to take all the guns away, so I think it's not particularly relevant to even think about, could we take all the guns away? I think the real questions are, can we pass 100% background checks that don't allow any sales or transfers of guns? Can we pass mandatory gun insurance? Can we restrict the ability of people to get high-capacity magazines and devices that clearly serve no purpose other than just doing massive destruction in a cartoon? I mean, cartoonish almost makes it sound like it's not serious, but it's so serious that it is almost cartoonish, the damage that some of these firearms can do. But I think that there is something about American culture, including the idea of, you know, the original colonies and then manifest destiny of spreading out to the West, and the idea of the homestead and protecting your homestead with firearms. I think you're right that there is definitely something cultural that goes above and beyond just the logic of the number of guns that are out there and sort of what makes sense compared to other countries. And you know what, Jared? I don't know of any way to change that.
Yeah, it's definitely a problem with our gun culture. It really is. But I just always think back to Australia, that, you know, they also had a gun culture as well.
Yep.
And, you know, eventually they got rid of theirs as well. But, hey, thank you for the call. And also just to let you know that there's a guy named Jimmy Dore. I don't know if you can have him on your program, but I would recommend him definitely as a guest.
All right, I'll look into him. Jimmy Dore. That's D-O-R-E, right?
Yeah, DORE.
Got it. Okay, I'll check into that. All right, thanks, Jared. Always great to hear from Jared from Downingtown, Pennsylvania. We will stay with the phones at 617-830-4750. Let's go to our caller from the 813 area code. 813, who's this and what's on your mind today?
This is Glenn in Tampa, Florida. Hey, David, I was just wondering, I'm not trying to be conspiratorial or anything like that.
Okay.
But when people talked about with the Vegas shooting the other night and everything, and they said they heard shots on the ground, and I was just wondering, it's not being conspiratorial. I don't think there was like this multiple planned terrorist attack or anything like that, or false flag. That's ridiculous. But don't you think it's possible, since I believe Nevada is open carry, people, and there were a lot of people there.
Yeah.
And don't you think it's not inconceivable that somebody, they hear the gunshots, they're packing, I mean, they freak out and they start shooting in the general direction of where the shots are coming from? And do you think that's possible, where people were hearing the shots on the ground? It was people like that who were trying to be, for lack of a better term, heroes?
Okay, very good. So I like the question because you're proposing something that's an alternative to the official story, but you're doing it in a more critically thinking way. You're not just being hyperbolic and conspiratorial. I think that the phrasing you're using, which is it conceivable that, being Nevada, that someone else did take out a gun and maybe fired that gun? I think it is absolutely conceivable. I think it is also absolutely conceivable that people who were on the ground thought that they were hearing what sounded like firearms being fired from the ground, but it was actually echo, ricocheting, and absolute and total chaos that made people believe that maybe that was going on when really it wasn't. And I think that, I mean, when you see the video, the eyewitness video that was taken of what was going on there, and when you research this idea of being able to identify the direction of gunfire and sort of the difficulties implicit with that, I think that is probably even more likely, you know?
Yeah. You know, I was just wondering, again, like I said, because I thought maybe there was just possibly some validity to it.
Yep.
And given that, again, I've heard people say, the reason I brought up was after the theater shooting in Aurora, there were people calling who were on various shows and whatnot were saying, you know, if I had a gun, if I'd have been in the theater, I would have taken the guy out. And the response, you know, was, well, you would have killed more people. So I was just wondering, maybe that was my theory, that maybe somebody was trying to be a hero and just start shooting in the general direction. And that might have been what people were hearing.
It's possible. And you know what? The Vegas scenario really illuminates the idea of the good guy with the gun as the solution to the problem. In the Aurora, Colorado theater shooting you're talking about, more people shooting firearms in a dark room is going to solve the problem. And in Vegas, imagine that 3 or 4 people do take out guns, police show up, they hear gunshots and see armed people. Even if they're good guys with guns, those people are probably getting shot, right? So it would not have been of much use in that particular case. So Glenn, thank you for the call. Appreciate it. Always good to hear from Tampa, Florida. And we will continue at 617-830-4750 with our caller from the 702 area code. Caller from 702, please tell us who you are and what's on your mind today.
Yeah, I'm Leon from Minnesota.
All right. What can we do for you?
I just had one question, and I'm fairly new to your channel, so...
Okay, please speak up as much as you can, because I can barely hear you, okay?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, just talk as loud as you can.
All right. I'm fairly new to your channel, so forgive if you've been asked this question before, but so you know about the alt-right and stuff, right? You've had like Richard Spencer on your channel and everything.
Yep.
So the way I've been seeing stuff, it seems like the skeptic community, since I don't have a name for it, has been starting to shift their focus on that now and less on like SJWs and stuff like that. So if this is where the discourse is, do you think you'll focus your channel more on stuff like that, or whenever there's anything that pertains to that sort of topics, or will you kind of stay the course?
You know, I heard you've got a bad connection. I heard SJWs and alt-right. Just restate just the question part. You're asking me if I'll focus more on what instead of what else?
Will you focus more on like the alt-right time, you know, or will you kind of stay the course on that?
We're talking about the alt-right. Pat, can you interpret the question for me?
I think he means will you talk about the alt-right, social justice warriors a little bit more, because those seem to be a little bit more topical now, versus issues like we normally discuss economics, gay marriage, abortion, all that stuff?
I mean, we did a long-form investigation into the alt-right. We did one on so-called regressive leftism, which really is authoritarian leftism. Yeah, I mean, I've criticized safe spaces and that type of thing. So, yeah, I mean, as necessary, we'll talk about it. You know what I mean? I think that we'll do it. We'll do the topics justice or something like that. Okay. All right. Better connection next time, okay? Because that was tough. That was a real tough one. Okay, let's go to 313. I think we tried 313 before and we heard nothing. So caller from 313, if you can hear me this time, please tell us who you are and where you're calling from.
My name is Ian Shabani, and I'm calling from Detroit, Michigan.
Okay, what's up?
Yeah, I just wanted to say I'm a libertarian, and I believe the solution to getting money and lobbyists out of government is to reduce the overall federal budget, which the corporations are trying to get a piece of. If the budget gets considerably reduced, then the government will have less power to give handouts to Wall Street, for example, or tax cuts and subsidies to big corporations. So I'm asking you, what is your take on how to get that stuff out of government while still having a large federal budget?
Okay, so so the concept is, right now, the reason that there's such an interest in having lobbyists and being involved with government is that government has such a large budget. They control tons of contracts for corporations. So there's an incentive to lobby government to give out these contracts. So you're suggesting if we shrink the amount that government is doing, it disincentivizes lobbying and money in politics. Is that right?
Okay.
I mean, am I stating your position correctly?
No, but like.
Hello? Yeah. Okay. Well, we lost them. It was an interesting question. I was just, Pat, trying to establish a common ground of what the assertion was, because my next question would have been, and I'll just ask it now because so people know where I was thinking, I would have said, what aspects of what do you want to take away from being under the purview of government? And then the next question would be, what would be the impact of taking that away from government and giving it directly to private industry? Because I think that's where we would come up with a problem, right? And that's where you get completely corporate controlled health insurance.
I think we're going to get somewhere. I don't know where that place would be, but I guess we'll never know.
I guess we'll never know. But I like that call. It was going in a direction I felt was good, and then we just lost connection. Okay, let's take a break, and we will be back with plenty more right after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Denise Smith. Denise, thank you. I thank you sincerely for supporting our program. The support of folks like Denise and everybody else over the last 6-7 months of the YouTube ad boycott has really been huge. So please join Denise, davidpakman.com/membership and patreon.com/David Pakman Show. Let's go back to the phones at 617-830-4750. We will pick up next our caller from the 201 area code. Caller from 201, tell us who you are and what's on your mind today.
David, John from New Jersey, buddy. Got a question for you.
Okay, go ahead.
With the breaking news that Secretary of State Rexon Tillerson has called Trump a moron and had to be talked out of quitting, do you actually think anyone in his own cabinet actually respects this buffoon-in-chief?
Does anyone respect Trump in his cabinet? I'm trying to think. Who might respect Trump in the cabinet? You think, I mean, H.R. McMaster does not respect Trump. I can't imagine Mattis respects Trump. Carson?
He likened Ben Carson to a pedophile.
Right. So I don't think Ben Carson respects him. Can you think, maybe does Betsy DeVos respect Trump? I don't know. I can't think of anyone.
He was the only one who stood by her, I guess.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm really not sure. I mean, let me ask you, do you think anybody respects Trump in his cabinet, John?
No, absolutely not. They're all in it to enrich themselves. They're in it for the money. Come on, David. You know that, buddy.
That's the overriding philosophy of the Trump administration, right? It's not small government versus big government or interventionist versus non-interventionist foreign policy. It's greed and self-enrichment above all else. That is the guiding principle that really unites this administration.
You got that right, pal.
Yep.
Thanks again. Talk to you next time.
All right, John. John from New Jersey. Great to hear from him. A lot of use of buddy and pal from John. He really seems to go to those. I like that. Let's go next to our caller from the 805 area code. Caller from 805, please say hello. Tell us who you are and what's on your mind today.
Hello, David. I'm Tony. I'm calling from Chicago.
Great. All right, Tony, speak up as much as you can and tell me what's on your mind.
My main thing that I wanted to speak to you about today was, obviously we're all talking about the Vegas shooting. I have family in Vegas, but, nobody got hurt. Anyways, I hear on the television the pundits and the Democratic senators saying that we should all call our congressmen and go to the offices and protest and do the same thing we did with the healthcare thing. But I'm wondering if that's going to be enough. I mean, the NRA is just so powerful. I mean, What do you think about that?
NRA is hugely powerful. You know, the crazy thing, I was thinking about this yesterday, Pat, after we did our NRA-related story. The NRA should if the NRA were sketchy, and they are, why wouldn't the NRA surreptitiously encourage protests in favor of new gun safety laws? Because the NRA during Obama sold a ton of guns by telling everybody Obama's going to take your guns. Under Trump, not as many guns are being sold because there isn't this narrative of Trump's coming for your guns. So the NRA should be, because remember, the NRA is a gun lobby. They want to sell as many guns as possible. The NRA should quietly encourage protests in favor of gun safety laws so that then they can say, look, they're trying to get Trump to take away your guns. You'd better buy more guns, right? Wouldn't that be a good strategy?
Especially because the NRA represents gun manufacturers rather than gun owners. If it was another group that represented the owners, maybe it wouldn't work. But in this case, I think it could.
Yeah. So, I mean, to answer your question, Tony, I don't know what it will take to pass basic gun safety laws. If you look after Sandy Hook with 85 or 90% approval for 100% universal background checks, it didn't pass under Obama. So if you couldn't do that, I don't see anything getting done anytime soon.
Another thing I noticed is that the media is incapable of juggling more than one story. So that's another thing that. I'm this morning already. Rex Tillerson's already taking over the whole cycle. It looks like, and I think the media is incapable of keeping the story in the people's mindset. You know, I mean, we see it on Twitter and everything, and all the everybody who is for which is the majority of us. But another thing that is discouraging is to see the media that's not going to be able to follow through the whole story.
Absolutely, Yeah, can't count on corporate media to do that. All right, Tony, thanks very much. Appreciate the call. Glad your family and friends in Vegas are okay. Let's go to our next caller from the 918 area code. Caller from 918. Who's this? What's on your mind today?
Yeah, this is Ben. My question is, what is your take on like the national debt? Is it like something that we should be like worrying about? Is it really like this big deal? And was Obama like at fault for like almost doubling it, or it being doubled?
Okay, yeah. So here's the thing. This is a good, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot, Ben. Can you explain to me the difference between the debt and the deficit?
I think you explained it one time, and I may be wrong. Isn't the deficit like where we're like taking money from, and the debt is just like,
That's good enough. Okay, so this is my point, Ben. And listen, I'm not calling you out or anything like that. President Obama reduced the deficit, which is the yearly amount by which our expenses exceed our revenues. So you can reduce the deficit, but if it's still positive, you will grow the debt because the debt is the year-over-year accumulation of how much we owe or are owed. So number one, to really have a conversation about this, we've got to understand that distinction, the difference between the deficit and the debt. The debt went up under President Obama, as it has under, as it did under George W. Bush, and for the most part, the deficit just goes up. I'm sorry, the debt goes up. Now I made the mistake. However, the amount by which it went up was reduced under President Obama. So to your question, should we worry about the debt? It's not that we should ignore, I don't know of any Democrats who say ignore the national debt. But the point is, we have to consider the national debt in relation to the total size of our economy, for example, because the bigger and bigger our economy gets, you can maintain a growing national debt that is the same percentage of the economy. So that's just some of the context that's often missing from the conversations. So do you pay off debt to prosperity? No, there's no economic indication that just starting to aggressively pay down the debt is going to drastically improve the economy. There's other actions that can be taken to improve the economy. Should we ignore the fact that the United States deficit spends? No, it shouldn't be ignored, but we shouldn't allow Republicans to start holding everybody hostage over it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So you wouldn't say Obama is at fault for like it going up and...
Well, again, listen, it depends what your expectations are. Obama reduced the deficit, so he slowed down the increase of the national debt. I don't think it's realistic to have assumed that Obama could have single-handedly gotten us a surplus, right? I mean, a lot of that is way bigger than any one president. All right, Ben, thanks so much. Very much appreciate the call. Let's go next to our caller from the 201 area code. Caller from 201, tell us who you are and what's on your mind today.
Hi, good afternoon, David. My name is Christian, and I'm from New Jersey, right across Manhattan.
Great.
And my question was actually more of a free trade question. Having taken microeconomics, you're told that free trade essentially has more access to goods for more people, and therefore the price is lower because of a bigger market.
Right.
And then one of the trade-offs for protectionism is the fact that you not only lose access to these to these goods, but that you're able to ultimately protect jobs. However, my teacher said that it's basically consensus among economists that these jobs eventually will be lost anyway due to innovation and technology.
Right.
And I was wondering what your take on that was. It seems to me that the progressive left is very much anti-free trade, but if put into this context, is it really that bad?
Right. So basically what you're pointing out is the difference between economics in the hypothetical world of the totally rational actor and perfectly open and free markets versus applying the reality of the fact that we're talking about people, right? So Daniel Kahneman has a lot of his work is based on this. It's based on the starting point is, hey, on paper, free trade allows people to have more access to goods because of specialization and bringing in things that other people can produce. And it reduces costs and it makes things more accessible. Great. That's rational economics. Then Daniel Kahneman says, well, let's apply how the real world actually works, and the world of politics, the world of psychology, the world of sociology and anthropology, etc. And it doesn't actually end up working that way. So I think that it's a really good starting point to start with what you and I were taught and are being taught in a class like microeconomics. But then we really need to get into the behavioral economics elements that modify this, because it doesn't actually end up working that way.
I see. And do you mind explaining or elaborating a little bit more into why it might not end up working that way?
Oh, I mean, it depends on specifically, this would be an entire show. But for example, there's wide consensus that you can change the significant economic decisions by people based merely on the wording of how you present a scenario, right? And so even though you could present two equivalent economic scenarios in sort of the net, if you present scenarios as either gains versus avoided losses, you will get drastically different responses. And if you believe in rational economic actors, that shouldn't happen, right? So this is a really good topic. It's a really in-depth topic, but I think that maybe something for a long-form investigation for us at some point.
Okay, thank you so much.
All right, thanks so much for the call. Very much appreciated. And on that note, we will take a break and continue it is Thursday, but it's kind of like a Friday show. We'll be back after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
For today's classic interview, very relevant, my interview from 2 years ago to the day with Steve Almond, who argues that football, the sport that he loved for so long, is immoral and we shouldn't watch it. And since this interview, we've of course learned after the death of former New England Patriots player Aaron Hernandez that even though he was quite young and relatively early in his career, he was suffering from severe CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, brain injury. And we've had this entire blow up regarding kneeling during national anthem. So I think that there is no better time to go back to my interview with Steve Almond from October 5th of 2 years ago, 2015. Let's check it out. I'm joined today by Steve Almond, author of Against Football, One Fan's Reluctant Manifesto, which is just out in paperback. The book is super interesting, Steve, and you're an admitted football fan who is sort of trying to rid yourself of football, and you have a number of ethical concerns around the game, which we'll get to. And, you know, in preparing for this interview, I was reminded of an interview I did with the Nation's Dave Zirin around the last World Cup, where he presented all sorts of very strong indictments of FIFA and of World Cups more broadly, but still said he doesn't think it's unethical or immoral to watch because you enjoy the game of soccer, but that you should be simultaneously advocating for change. Now, when it comes to football for you, you feel that that is not an okay solution. In other words, you really need to rid yourself of football, as you say.
Well, I think the book is trying to present the football for what it really is, the biggest central narrative in American culture, the most popular sport, the most profitable sport, the largest activity or narrative that we all have in common. I think it's bigger than religion at this point. It's bigger than the bonds of family in many cases. And I'm really interested in what it means, both as a phenomenally interesting game narrative, and also maybe even as almost like a spiritual thing for a lot of people, but also what the dark side of it is. So the book isn't trying to say you should do this or you should do that, but you should know exactly what it is you're sponsoring when you sit down to watch a game. And I think that's the place where I do depart from somebody like Dave Zirin, although I really appreciate how intelligently he writes about sports and how morally grounded he is as a commentator. I think it's very basic. Roger Goodell and the folks who run the big college football programs and the whole football industrial complex, they don't care whether you're guilt-stricken. They don't care whether you are sort of cheering with a big foam rubber hand in one hand and maybe with a fist sort of advocating with the other, because they're really keeping score in a very basic way. Are you a sponsor? Are you tuning in? Are you contributing to the revenues of big football? And the answer is yes. If you're a fan, that's what you're doing. But that's my answer. There are a lot of people who are going to read the book and say, well, I might cut back on my consumption, or I might become more active and involved when it comes to questioning how my tax dollars are spent at the level of high school or pro or college football. So it's not trying to advocate any one solution like boycott football. It's much more, hey, you should think about what everything that football is, because it's extraordinarily complicated and it's woven through the fabric of almost everything we do in America at this point.
Give us the sort of bullet points of what these areas of concern are. And then, you know, I have some that I'm going to want to dive into. The ones that to me strike me are, of course, this pervasive brain injury disaster and systematic cover-up that has been exposed several times now.
Right.
And how that impacts how we see college football and even high school football, really.
Right.
The corporatism, no question about that. The greed, which some write off as sort of billionaires versus millionaires, which is not at all the reality, as Dave Zirin has exposed when we look at owners versus players. What else is there?
Well, I think there are things that are a little bit squishier and more subtle, but you know, the major thing is that you have to accept that you're watching a form of entertainment in which you incur none of the risk and in which up to a third of the pro players are going to get brain damage. That's the big one that, for me, having seen my mom suffer a cognitive collapse, basically, I just kind of turned my stomach. But beyond that and beyond the sort of the greed that's just sort of built into American capitalist culture, are issues that have to do with the way that masculinity is defined and femininity, the way that sort of gender and orientation work. And I think the main thing that really troubled me the more I thought about two things, really: the way in which football has become inextricably linked to the educational process in this country at the high school and college level. That just makes no sense to me, that a game that essentially segregates people and values them purely for their physical worth, and that also clearly now the research indicates has deleterious effects on people's brain function, somehow are a huge part of our educational system and the tax dollars that are spent on it. And the other thing is that it really sanitizes and normalizes violence. I think in this way it's symptomatic of American culture. But the thing about football that just makes it distinct from something like rugby or especially boxing is we really come to believe, as when we watch football, we allow a certain kind of magical thinking to infect us. We honestly think that a 280-pound player who comes up against another 300-pound player, with 70 G-forces, maybe 100 times a game, isn't going to be permanently damaged and maybe even brain damaged by that contact. We allow ourselves to believe that it's not real violence. And I think that abstracting of what real violence is and its real human toll is the same mentality that's in operation when, for instance, we send soldiers overseas and they suffer whatever they suffer. And then when they come back to the United States, we just aren't particularly interested in their suffering.
Do you think that, well, let me frame it a different way. There's many people I know who, if I said to them, football really has this inherent tolerance for what are debilitating brain injuries to a significant percentage of the players. Football really has this tolerance for this total corporatism. Football tolerates even arguably homophobia and even racism in some cases, blah, blah, blah. And they would look at me and with a totally straight face, they would say, David, I know what you're saying, but I just like watching the game. I don't believe any of those things, and watching the game isn't going to change my opinion. Is that a valid defense in your mind, or are you legitimizing those problems merely by watching?
I don't know that you're legitimizing them. I think you're consuming and really in that way kind of taking part in a game that has certain values that we really would never condone outside the realm of football. That's what's so amazing about football. It's such a remarkable spectacle. It's so thrilling, and our attachment to it is so deep that we essentially throw whatever moral qualms we might have out as citizens, as parents, as maybe even as people of faith. Those go out the window. If you think about how Jesus would regard the Jesus I'm talking about, sort of the Sermon on the Mount, who was turn the other cheek, avoid violence.
Right, not the evangelical right-wing Jesus.
Well, right, the guy who was, turning over the money changers' tables, who was a radical who believed in the gospel of love as a revolutionary force. That Jesus would look at football and say, oh, I recognize that. The nearest cognate I have is the spectacles that the Romans throw, these gladiatorial combats where there's clear bloodlust, there's a clear effort to distract the people from incompetent venal leadership and from a kind of injustice that I am trying to, my whole mission is to put across, that we've got to be more merciful and kind and less violent towards one another. There, a lot of people would say they believe in what Jesus said on the Mount, and then they would, watch a football game, and when a running back scores a touchdown by knocking the linebacker senseless and says, thank God, I'm glad, I believe in God, and I'm glad he was watching over this gridiron, they would see no sense of cognitive dissonance. But in this sense, David, it's really, it's more typical of an American human, but especially an American mindset. That is, we love certain pleasures in this culture, but we don't like interrogating those pleasures morally. It's very unpleasant. We all love bacon, or most of us do, but we certainly have no interest in going to the slaughterhouse. What my book is attempting to do is to say, look, I loved football for 40 years as a sport and as a spectacle. It's ecstatic and beautiful. It's the body at play. It's greatness and poise and discipline and teamwork and all these virtues, many of them manly, but still virtues that are nothing but laudable. And also, while you're consuming all that, there's also this other stuff. And this other stuff is really, you're a part of the larger system that fosters that. You talked about homophobia as like maybe the NFL is homophobic. It's not a maybe. When you have a collective freak out at the idea that a single gay employee is going to enter your workforce, that's just, when you look at any other workplace, we would never accept that. Maybe the Catholic Church or, an evangelical business, but we would never accept that in most other realms of our life. Just like we would never accept a workplace where the ownership says, yeah, 30% of the employees are going to get long-term cognitive ailments, but what are you going to do? It's just they incur the risk. They know what they're doing. We don't watch coal miners get black lung, right? But we could all recognize that it was a real problem and the workplace needed to change. We are actually watching the coal miners get black lung. That's what we're doing every Sunday. We're watching guys who are getting brain damage, and we're seeing some of them take their own lives or sort of suffer in silence years later. And we're saying collectively and individually, I'm okay with that.
And have you successfully stayed away from watching football the first 3 weeks of the current season?
I have to say I have, but it's not easy because, because I am a sports fan, I check to see, what's going on with the baseball team I follow, and are there any interesting highlights? And also, sports is on everywhere. It's sort of the national wallpaper. And I do notice that my team, the long-suffering Oakland Raiders, seem to somehow miraculously not be doing terribly. In fact, doing surprisingly well. So now the real challenge comes in. It's not when your team is lousy and you turn away. It's when your team is doing great and you then have to turn away. And I just want to say, it's not like I'm loving it or just sitting there going, oh, well, what a dumb game, and I can't believe I ever watched it. I know exactly why I watched it. It's unbelievably alluring. And all my book is trying to do is say, what is it like when you have to walk away from something you really love? Because you learn so much about it that you realize there's a lot of unlovable parts to it that are sort of infecting you without you entirely realizing it.
Let me remind everybody, the book is called Against Football, One Fan's Reluctant Manifesto. It's now out in paperback. We've been speaking with the book's author, Steve Almond. Thank you so much for telling us about it.
Absolutely. Thank you.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Let's get to some audience questions. Eddie wrote the first one. Eddie says, hey, what's a common known debunked hoax that you still meet people who believe that it is real? One that came to mind is cracking knuckles. I kind of crack my knuckles pretty frequently. And growing up, there would always be someone every couple years who would say, when you crack your knuckles, it causes arthritis and it causes your hand to swell. And there's actually a guy who for something like 50 years cracked the knuckles only on one hand. And after that point, he was tested for sort of mobility as well as size. And no cracking on one hand, cracking for 50 years or something crazy on the other hand. No difference in mobility and no swelling or difference in size at all.
I don't think it's the best habit, though. I mean, I do it
Really?
myself as well. But,
What's bad about it?
Well, it's just, one, it's kind of annoying to other people. But also, I remember not being able to crack my knuckles when I was younger.
Yeah.
And then as I started doing it more and more, now I can just crack them all the time.
Right. Yeah, no, that does happen. Yeah. But I don't think that that's a reason. I mean, it being annoying to other people, I don't know that that's a good reason to do it or not do it. I guess it depends what kind of relationships you want to have with the people around you. I don't know, but it's never been an impediment to me. I mean, this is, some people will not like this, but specific religious stories, I'm meeting people that believe them, right? Like Noah's Ark. Jesus is coming back any day. Pick whatever you want, right? When I meet people that literally believe those things, to me, it's a little bit weird, to be quite honest. And then vaccines cause autism, right? I mean, we get emails from people, even though it's been widely debunked, I still get emails from people with links to obscure blogs or strange YouTube videos, and they are convinced that, no, just vaccines cause autism, period. The people are still out there.
I think a lot of these appeal to a sense of fear or a sense of wonder, maybe. Like, I remember when I was a kid, I heard that your blood is actually blue until you get a cut or something, and the blood is exposed to oxygen, and then it turns red. That's obviously not true. I think they just see those charts of veins, and some of them are seen as blue, so maybe your blood is actually blue too.
I assumed that it was just a much darker red. That might, to some people, look bluish, but I didn't literally think that your blood was blue until exposed to oxygen. I don't know, but that's an interesting one, yeah.
And another one maybe that you swallow 8 spiders per year when
That's
you're
not
sleeping.
true, right?
Not true.
No, it's 12. Everybody knows that it's
12
actually
plus.
12 or more spiders. No, but I think, though, that it is true that you do. I mean, when I'm biking, I seem to swallow 2 or 3 mosquitoes or bugs of different kinds just through my open mouth.
I'm not allowed to because I'm vegan.
I know, yeah, so you don't do that. What do, you know, that's actually a funny thing. My girlfriend is pescatarian. Does a fly count as what? It's not seafood, right? So if we're biking and a pescatarian or a vegan accidentally eats a bug, what do you do?
Well, I mean, I guess there's no intent there. So you're not morally responsible for it.
So you're applying the same laws to your veganism as Jews apply to kosher food. Like if someone tricks you into eating pork, you had no intent to eat pork, so technically you've not sinned, I guess.
You're absolved from any controversy.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, and then just general conspiracy theories, I guess I would add, right? I mean, there's a lot of conspiracy theories. I don't have to name them. We don't have to go through every single one of them, but there's lots of conspiracy theories that I'm still shocked that people believe.
And there's a whole show dedicated to this. You can check out Mythbusters, and they've done hundreds of them, maybe.
Yeah, and some of those are conspiracies, and some of are more like these common sense things that are not really common sense of any kind. Although it's been years since I've watched that show.
Like throwing a penny over the Empire State Building. Will that kill someone when it hits the ground? Yes, you got to watch the show to find out.
My recollection is that the penny, if it could not flip at all and fall straight down, it could go fast enough to really hurt someone, but that in practical terms, if you toss a penny off the Empire State Building, because it will sort of tumble naturally, it will not achieve any kind of speed that would actually hurt someone. Is that true?
I just thought that the terminal velocity of it wasn't to a point where it was actually lethal.
Oh, okay.
Like it may actually hurt, but it wouldn't kill you.
Well, that's a much more reasonable explanation. Yeah. So anyway, these are some of mine. Send in some of the ones you're still talking to people about, and if you saw my email, you'd see lots of them. That's for sure. Kip wrote in. Kip says, hey, David, it seems like warfare is really changing between drones, cyber war, sanctions, and other tools. Will we ever have a major world war yet again? Very interesting question. I think that we are clearly going away from the idea of these major world wars being possible for a few reasons. Now, I'm against nuclear proliferation. I am against it. But it is true that if it is known that a country has nuclear weapons, it does serve as somewhat of a deterrent to a country that does not have them from getting involved militarily in some kind of major war sort of scenario. Although I think that there are way more reasons to proliferate from nuclear weapons than to have them as a deterrent. Globalization is a major factor, right? When you look at trade right now and you look at the sort of supply chain, there are fewer and fewer parts of the world that are sort of disconnected from impacting major Western powers, which it's just sort of the reality. That's a big factor in terms of how warfare, like the old days, is or isn't going to be done. So I think that globalization and trade deals are a big part of why we wouldn't see that. And I also think that cyber warfare and drones are a really, really big factor because you can do much more damage relative to the risk that you expose yourself to through technological means like drone warfare as well as cyber warfare. So I do believe that we are moving away from the sort of major world war and wars of the style of World Wars I and II and the Vietnam War.
Well, just starting with the nuclear weapons point, I mean, since the 50s, we've had the concept of mutually assured destruction.
Yep.
But I think that assumes that we have rational actors in our roles of leadership.
Yes.
And when you look at like Donald Trump,
Kim Jong-un,
I mean, you can't just make that assertion necessarily.
I think that sometimes we understate the rationality of Kim Jong-un. And believe me, I am a major critic of Kim Jong-un, but I guess what I'm talking about is the North Korean regime at large. We are now in the 3rd generation of this wacky megalomaniac family running North Korea, and they still do seem to have limits as to what they do. They will bluster, they will do missile tests and make incredible threats, but they haven't actually gone further. And I know that a lot of people will say, well, they've not yet developed the mega nuke that they could drop on New York City. But I'm not talking about that. They've not gone even nearly as far as their current technology would allow them to. So while I believe that Kim Jong-un and that regime is incredibly erratic, I do think, Pat, that some people overstate the erraticism of the North Korean regime. When it comes to starving their own people, there is no overstating it. But when it comes to at any point they'll launch a nuke against the U.S., we're on generation 3 right now.
Right. I mean, they may just be waiting to a point where they can attach a nuclear weapon to a warhead. Though,
lying in wait until that key
hit
moment.
The West Coast.
Maybe. I don't know. Do you think there's something to it, though, that they do seem to have some limits to what they know would just create? It would be a suicide action.
It's mostly bluster. I mean, how can we say for sure? But even if there's a 5% chance, that's still very, very concerning.
Yeah, it's a 1 out of 20 chance, and they've made more than 20 threats so far. Okay, so very good question. I do believe we are moving away from this paradigm of the sort of major world war as we saw during the 20th century. Okay, last question today is from Carter. Carter says, lots of people have mutual funds, and in those mutual funds, lots of people have shares of health insurance companies. If universal health care is passed, whether it's Medicare for all or some other system, do all those people owning health insurance shares get crushed? Well, a couple things. Number one, there are many more players in the health insurance market that are probably in most people's mutual funds than just for-profit health insurance companies. There are nonprofit health insurance companies. There are the hospital ownership chains. There are the pharmaceutical companies. There are many other players, I guess, is what I'm saying. So that for-profit insurance companies will definitely be negatively affected if something like Medicare for All were to pass, but that's not all that you might be exposed to if you are a mutual fund holder. But it is a fair question, which is if you're just an average middle-of-the-road person with a little bit of money in mutual funds, and you would benefit from the existence of Medicare for All itself, if a bunch of these companies that depend on healthcare being for-profit all of a sudden go out of business or have to significantly downsize and their shares, the value of their shares plunge, that is going to plunge the retirement accounts of some of those people. Logically, there's something to that. But what you have to remember is that the overwhelming majority of shares of stock are already held by the very, very rich. And even among those who are not of the richest tier of the economy, but have shares of mutual funds or stocks, they have a disproportionately small amount. So there's really no way to say to Carter, no, you're wrong. It would not have any impact on those businesses. But I think it's also important not to overstate the importance of that and to not understate the importance of eliminating the possibility of a medical bankruptcy, which is a reality right now under our current system.
So under Bernie Sanders' plan, it would be like a 4-year transition process into Medicare for all. I mean, I guess the people working in the for-profit health insurance companies would have other roles they can go into because care would be contracted out, so there would still be some administrative roles they could fill in. When you talk about the stock market, I mean, of course there would be uncertainty, even though there's a 4-year transition period. When it's initially passed or just even debated, of course those stocks are going to crash, right? I mean, you can't say for sure.
Well, I actually think that you're getting at the real stock market risk that exists, which isn't individual mutual funds will have a decrease in value as a result of the components of those mutual funds that are impacted by single-payer healthcare losing money.
Yes.
I think that there will be such a shock to the system if there were to be a transition to Medicare for all, that there would be a general market crash, at least initially, although ultimately Medicare for all could provide significant demand-side stimulus to people by reducing the amount that families are spending on healthcare. Your average lower middle or middle-class family is going to take the money that they're saving and they're going to reinvest it into their local economy. It could actually be really stimulative, but in the short run, it's going to be bad.
Certainly something to brace for, too, if Democrats are going to be pushing for this in the next few years, because if the stock market is facing negative repercussions from it, I mean, that's going to play into the argument of Republicans, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And Bill Scher did mention that earlier this week. Bill Scher said that when you talk about the total shakeup of such a major industry, aside from the merits of Medicare for all, you have to consider the strength with which many of these industries would fight against it. And that's not... I'm in favor of Medicare for all, to be super clear, but Bill Scher was not wrong in saying that you would have insurance companies fighting for their lives, and that would be sort of part of what would have to be managed. But very good question, Carter. I mean, this is the type of thing people should be thinking about, right? Well, what are other ways in which it might maybe negatively affect the average consumer of healthcare, middle-class person in the United States? All right, that's it for today. We've got a great bonus show for you. Stay tuned, davidpakman.com/membership if you don't yet have access to the bonus show. And of course, patreon.com/davidpakmanshow, which also now at the $5 level gives you instant access to every single one of our bonus shows.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.